Yes, it is a cast of thousands, and it really picks up on some of the points, as Hannah was saying, that we heard. There was a gentleman over here talking about secularisation within journalism, and also I think the lady from the Baha'i community who was talking about the impact of local radio in particular, and we've got Alex here to talk about that. But before we start, last year the Religion Media Centre, with the generous help and funding from the Culham St Gabriel Trust, embarked on a tour of 5 cities right across the UK, Plymouth, Nottingham, Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester. And in each of those cities, we brought together journalists, faith groups, community leaders, teachers and religious advisors in an attempt to bridge that gap between faith and journalism. Okay, so how did we do? What more do we need to do in terms of making those groups speak more to each other? Let's have a look at a short film that explains a little bit more.
The idea of creative connections is to get around the country, we're now in Birmingham for example, and to find out what is actually going on the ground. We want to talk to those people who are actively involved with their faith and then bring them together with journalists, editors, broadcasters and get them to talk to each other and communicate so that long after we've left there's a real dialogue between them. So much is going on in the religious area, real importance, tremendous social work and other things which just most people don't know about.
Sometimes people don't know how to articulate their projects.
I don't have really got a clue as to who to contact, how to make the contact.
There is slight wariness of engaging with the media and of stories not being portrayed, authentically.
We've got people who are wanting to communicate their stories but are a bit nervous about the media. And you've got the media who are desperate for content, stories to tell, people's stories to tell. And actually, they don't know much about the religious communities.
Just give them the whole picture, come with a package, and then that's more helpful to the news organisations to pick up immediately. And I felt that was just a really important point for all of us who have stories.
I'm very passionate about my job and the city that I live in and the people that make this city tick.
This understanding is something that religious education also seeks to encourage, trying to enable young people to understand the communities that they're growing up in, to understand themselves, their own worldview, in a bigger context of the world that they are growing into. And that means that they need to have a better understanding of communities, beliefs, practices, and religious understanding in our society as a whole.
Social media, there's like a wider audience. You can connect with anyone. You can hear other people's views on certain topics.
So I believe you need to do your own research and then go back onto social media because it can be quite narrow and it can create an echo chamber.
In all the newsrooms I worked in, you'd have this thing about faith and not being really understood. So it would be all about festivals. It's Chinese New Year, let's go and film that dragon. It's Ramadan, we must do something on Ramadan. And that's the only times that we would ever interact with those faith groups, not knowing there's 1,000 stories behind all of that. So these events are really important because it means that we're listening to people and we're understanding what makes them tick and what those faiths can reveal for us as journalists.
I think my takeaway is that the relationship isn't strong enough, but that there is goodwill on both sides to build those relationships. And I think the key word that has emerged at them all is the issue of trust. And I think it's possible to build that. And I think it's possible for faith groups to be reassured that journalists want to tell their stories and want to tell them well.
I hope this is the beginning of a journey, because I think everything we've been hearing is all about trust and relationships.
You are a room full of people of faith, and I think my takeaway is I would urge you to have faith. You'll learn as you go along and just get your stories out there. So it's have faith in us.
If you feel strongly about something, if you feel that you do have a story, if you feel that you deserve a space on that platform, speak to someone.
Don't assume that somebody else has phoned them in. because I think most people do that. Somebody will know about this and it'll be in the media, but nobody else knows about it. It just happened on that street and that's it.
We've brought the people together, the religious communities and the media. We've introduced them to each other. We've opened up lines of communication that weren't there before. I suppose we'll see over the coming months and years whether the coverage of religious stories on a local level improves, and then we'll be able to say it's been really effective. The early signs are that relations have been built here that are really strong.
A brief summation of the 5 cities that we visited, the faith groups that we heard from. And just to remind you, it was really decided that what we wanted to do was to help journalists gain greater knowledge and understanding of faith groups, and for faith leaders also in turn to understand how they could access the media. So I think there was lots of learning on both sides. It was generously supported by the Culham St Gabriel Trust, and Kathryn Wright is the CEO of the Culham St Gabriel Trust. I'll get it right one day. Do you want to tell us what your organisation does?
Yeah, thanks so much, Leo. And I've watched that film a few times now, and it just heartens me every time. So I'm Kathryn Wright, and I've been Chief Executive for 3 years at Culham St Gabriel's. We are an endowed charitable foundation. And our vision is for promoting an education in religion and worldviews. We're particularly interested in what that means in schools, but increasingly we see that education is much bigger than that. And we're really interested in public perception of religion and worldviews more widely, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to support this project. I think you did an excellent job. Yeah. I have to say, actually, that the evaluation report, which was written about this, was... everyone on the trustee body was so excited when they read it. They were really heartened by it. And I know we're going to hear about some of different people's perspectives and things, but it's actually a real pleasure to be here because I think it really was successful. There were also learning points too, which I know you're going to develop and think about. But as a funder, it's the kind of project you want to see because the impact was clear, even in the film.
Okay, Kathryn, just for the moment, thank you. We'll come back to you. Let me introduce you then to our huge panel, who all in some shape or form had something to do with the 5 city projects. Maybe just raise your hand, because I'm going to do it all in the wrong order. Frances Finn, an ordained priest and also a BBC broadcaster and journalist, and she presented at the Nottingham event. Michelle Mayman, who is editor of BBC North West Tonight, who took part in the Manchester event. Alex Strangwayes-Booth, who you've already heard, getting very animated about BBC local radio. She's a religious specialist and looks after all of those faith programmes. If you don't know, in every single local radio station there is a faith programme, so we can hear from Alex. Mark Thomas, who's from ITV, who as well as being a journalist, also has a responsibility for diversity and inclusion, and we'll hear more about that in a second. And there's one of you in every single region, isn't there, for ITV?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Good, thank you. I'm glad we got that yes in, that's very good. And directly representing some of those faith communities, Dr. Jagbir Jhutti-Johal, who is reader in Sikh Studies at the University of Birmingham, and you took part in the Birmingham event, didn't you? And also the Rev Clive Foster, who's a pastor and a multi-faith manager at Nottingham Trent University, who was also an organiser and a presenter at the Nottingham event. So as I say, everybody had something to do with it. Frances, let me start with you, because you've clearly got this vantage point of being both a journalist and a BBC person and somebody who is also a priest. So what did you want to get out of this session, and did it work for you?
I think the word trust was mentioned a lot, and I think that was the big win in trying to build trust that I can only speak for the BBC, but we genuinely want to hear about people, their lives, the transformational experiences they've had, what faith brings, community, and to give some kind of expression to that. I think in Nottingham, we've got fairly good relationships anyway, but there were certainly people in the room that were surprised perhaps to hear that there is a place for their story and that we're not always wanting to reflect things when they go wrong. And unlike news, I think our programmes in terms of faith broadcasting on BBC local radio, it can be more featurey. So we're not always looking, for that thing that's going to get a major headline. Certainly as a broadcaster and a priest, my mission, if you like, is to kind of translate faith for the whole audience and to remind people that basically it is a thing. and keep it in the conversation and reflect a true picture of what is motivating people, what gets folks out of bed and what brings them together in Nottinghamshire. And faith is a huge part of that. So I think I was happy that by the end of that day, there was reassurance and trust built.
Do you recognise what was being said over here in the previous session? And you're best placed, I presume, to answer this kind of question, that there is a secularisation of most BBC staff and journalists these days.
Yeah,
it's a problem.
Yeah, do you know, I do think there is probably a grain of truth in the fact that the journalist mind is one that works in a certain way, and veracity is important. Empirical evidence, that's the sort of ways of working, isn't it? How you're thinking. And so when you're presented with a faith community that might espouse things that you can't, weigh and measure, there's going to be a bit of a clash there. And it's easier perhaps not to be curious about it and just write it off as a minority freak thing. And I think, again, I feel that my positioning is such that I hope to bridge a few gaps locally where I am, and that it's not a minority thing for people who don't think about themselves, if that makes any sense. So yeah, there potentially is a clash. And when it comes to commissioning and what makes a good idea, what makes something others might be interested in, of course you're shaped by your own values. And if faith isn't a value in there, then it might not seem as interesting. But actually we found that it is to a lot of people.
This idea then of secularisation, you could also say it's a lack of religious literacy, perhaps, amongst journalists, which is the whole reason that the RMC exists in a way. Mike, I know you're passionate about this subject. Why do you think there is, Clive, sorry, why do you think there is this kind of lack of literacy right now?
Well, I think there has to be an acceptance that we are made up of a diverse community, and our diverse communities is going to be reflected in our religious beliefs as well. And so it's important that there is just an acceptance of that, and that is the reality across the country, particularly in Nottingham, where over 35 or 38% Black and Asian minority ethnic. The census coming up is going to push us well over 40. I work at the University, Nottingham Trent University. We recognise that students come from all over the globe, and people will come where faith actually to them is very important. It's a way of life. And so the university, the role that I'm doing there is about accepting that. But as Fran was saying, we're quite fortunate in Nottingham that we've been working hard to bring different faiths together. But there has to be some kind of a common area where we can come together. And one of the ways that we've been doing that in Nottingham, I feel, is around areas of social injustice, which is common to many different faiths, whether that is hate crime, whether that's other issues. And then in those spaces, there is the ability to talk about our faith and accept one another's faith. Because I think we have to agree as well is that even within different faith beliefs, there are differences quite well held. And so the more that we can come together around things where we can work in common, the more opportunity it gives us to actually share and accept the different
So specifically on the Five Cities project, do you think that we made some headway in bridging that gap between journalists, broadcasters and faith communities?
I do in Nottingham because I would share and agree with what Fran was saying about how trust is important. I think in Nottingham we're highly favoured because we've got someone like Fran who is who straddles both, as it were, areas. I think the main thing that was coming out in Nottingham, one of the issues was around faith leaders being in front of the media and then feeling that they would get tripped up by the media. Yeah. And so there was sometimes a reluctance to engage in that because there was a feeling that what they wanted to portray or say wouldn't get covered. But at the end of it, we had some really good talk about doing some actually media training, which is what I think some of our faith leaders were welcoming.
Well, we'll come back to where we might go next. Jagbir, you're an academic at Birmingham University. Do you recognise some of the stuff that Clive is saying there?
Yes, I do. I think one of the important things with reference to faith literacy is that we recognise that not everybody has. So as academics, but also as communities, we recognise that you will not know everything about our faith, right? But what we would like is a recognition that you would come to somebody and kind of fact check sometimes. And one of the big things for Sikhs is that you refer, in terms of certain journalists and in media reports, Vaisakhi is referred to as a new year. It's not, right? And as community groups, we've tried to feed into media outlets to try and provide them with that information. And it's building that relationship up where you have that level of trust where the journalists and the media can come and speak to somebody who has that knowledge and who can provide you with input so that you don't cause offence, for example, in the way that you report a certain issue or a certain festival, for example. And I think the other thing that is important, one is the element of trust, but also representation. A lot of the time when the media talk to community groups or representatives, they go to the gatekeepers, men of a particular age. You do not get to see the young people and you do not get to see the women, right? And that is something that I'm really passionate about, that those women's voices and the young people's voices do need to be heard. And I think that the young people, through the 5 cities, kind of demonstrate that they have a voice. They want to be heard on certain issues. And we need to know what they are thinking about faith and mental health, the assisted dying bill. What are their views from a faith perspective? We've got the Commonwealth Games coming up. What does faith and sport mean? Is the media looking into that and everything? I am at the University of Birmingham, where we're hosting the Commonwealth Games, and that's one of the big things that we're trying to do in making sure that faith and the Commonwealth is interconnected so that we have those discussions taking place. Now, yeah, it's building that level of literacy.
Who are the best people at listening to you and doing the right kind of stories?
So it's the journalists who will who come with that, in a sense, it's humility, and they're not scared to say, look, we don't completely understand what the issue is with reference to Afghanistan and the Sikh community, right? Can you explain to us, how are they different from the Sikhs back home in Punjab? And I will kind of say, well, ethnically they are different. They are not Indian Sikhs. They are Afghan Sikhs. I will talk about the different languages, certain different cultural aspects, so that they know that when they are writing up, that they can distinguish between an Afghan Sikh and, say, for example, an Indian Sikh. So I think it's when you build up that relationship and when you see that somebody is genuinely interested in getting to the crux of the issue, that you can build up a relationship of trust and then also feel that actually your story is being respected and that you are not. It's not to cause mischief or harm.
Jagbir, thank you. Michelle, you're the editor of regional television news based in Salford. You were at our Manchester event. So you now, born again, you're kind of very well up on all the faith groups within your particular... But it's a huge patch, isn't it? Manchester, Liverpool, really Lancashire, Cumbria.
And with many diverse communities, and I would say that just as a postcode can designate a community, a religious group can also designate a community. And that's why it's quite important for us to be across events and things that are coming up. I think the thing I remembered from our Manchester session was we got down to the bare bones of practicalities quite a lot about how do you pitch a story, how do you get a story placed. And we talked a lot about building up relationships with journalists that you trust, because trust was really important, but also understanding how a programme is put together, how many days it takes to put together the evening news. It doesn't all happen on the day, and it certainly doesn't happen 2 months before when someone sent me a press release saying, do you know Diwali's coming up? And like, that's quite a long, that's an age in the minds of the journalists. We've got a kind of, our span of attention is maximum 3 days. You know, if you tell me something's coming up there, I can work with you. And it's about touching base, having a contact, getting back in touch, understanding the practicalities on the day. You wouldn't believe how many times we've gone to someone to do a story about something they've told us about, an event that they've told us about, and then half the people that they promised were going to be there weren't there. So we've got to make something to go on TV in one day, starting filming at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it will be on TV that night. We need everything in place.
Have you seen more people coming forward since that event to offer you stories?
Yeah, and we've definitely had more. We actually talked more about it in the newsroom. So, for example, just recently it was Ramadan, and we did a story about prayers at Ewood Park Football Club. It was the first time prayers had been held at Ewood Park Football Club, and actually it was a new story. It was something new. It hadn't happened before. It wasn't just about, hey, did you know it's Ramadan? It was, look at this community in action. And it works really well for a programme like mine. So I do the 6:30 evening programme, and we try to take you on a journey from that hard news that starts at the top of the programme. And by the end of the programme, I'm going to deliver you to the one show. I do not want to end my programme on hard news. You know, the 6 o'clock news, sometimes its final story will be an obituary. That's fine for them, it's not fine for me. I need to leave you somewhere good. And actually, there are some great stories amongst your communities that really matter.
And huge audience engagement still for those 6:30 programmes across the whole of the UK. Mark from ITV, I'm sure there's a lot of things there will echo with you. But tell us, first of all, a bit about your role. You took part in the South West event.
Yeah, that's right. So
in Plymouth.
Yeah, so I'm a news editor with ITV West Country, which involves fixing and planning stories. But another hat that I wear is I'm a diversity and inclusion champion, and as a white heterosexual middle-aged male, that doesn't look particularly good for ITV. But in a way, I hope that kind of drives me more to really commit to that role. Michelle will know, like when you talk about 3 days for that kind of news agenda, I actually, I really get that. But I think, we heard about trust there and about religious literacy as well earlier on. And I think something that regional news programs can do in a way that perhaps is harder for the 6 o'clock or for the 10 o'clock news is to reflect and to celebrate the diversity and richness of a community and all that looks like. And we have a panel which gives an opportunity for people from a diverse range of backgrounds to talk about our programs, to talk about what's big in their world, but also to meet us. So, everyone from ITV West Country is able to join this. We do media training. We invite them to our studio in Bristol, which I'm always caught out by how much that is like such a highlight of the calendar. They can come present the weather, not actually present the weather, but, just being a part of it and meeting people. And then there is that trust. But what is key is that you build on that and you don't betray it. And what you said about listening, I think it's absolutely, oh my God, my heart sings when I hear that, when a reporter thinks, actually, I don't know about this. Tell me more, and being prepared to have space. And, also one of the things about our panels is we want the people who are on it to be critical friends, to hold us to account and to tell us when we get it wrong and how we can be better. And that is really important. It's not always easy, but it's good. But we are lucky to have that space to give people the opportunity to kind of engage with us away from the day. And one final thing, we did a piece last week, not last week, the meeting was last week, recently about Passover. There's a very small Jewish community in Devon and Cornwall, but it was really important to me that we showed this piece, fell the same day as Good Friday. And there was a discussion afterwards, was this kind of, that kind of event, all them with that kind of coverage. And the rabbi joined the panel and he said, we felt seen. We felt that we existed in the Southwest, and we got so many people who got in touch and said how much that they loved the piece. Now the challenge for us, is to build upon that. But just that first step was just so great. It didn't happen just like that. It happened as a result of a whole bunch of conversations. Now we know the synagogue in Bristol is 150 years old. hey, great, there's a piece to be told there. Maybe when we want to do a story about perhaps the cost of living crisis, we can find a family who uses the synagogue to help us tell that story. So,
thank you. We'll come back to that. And it's great that ITV have got one of you across its entire regional network as well. So thumbs up for ITV. Alex, BBC Local Radio, I mean, you've got a role that kind of encompasses all of the 40 stations now. I always forget the exact number, to be honest. But as we were saying before when Aline was speaking, that you're really the front door, aren't you, for faith groups getting their stories and what's happening in their communities onto the BBC.
Well, yes, we are. But in many ways, I've been doing this. I've been in the BBC now for 25 years, which, may be too long. But this is a conversation that has been going on for the whole 25 years of my career. And I have done community broadcasting pretty much exclusively during that time. So, what concerns me about this conversation is a sort of lack of, and I'm not just talking about the BBC, I'm talking about kind of the whole of society, of starting something and seeing it through. So, I think, one time it's like this community project's all in all the rage, and the next year this community project's all the rage. And I sometimes wish that some of the community projects I did 15 years ago had kept going for 15 years, because then we would already have a lot more diverse staff, we would have better links in those communities. So I would like to see more commitment from the broadcasters to maintaining projects, to starting them and then maintaining them for, years, not just 6 months. So, that's something I've seen. I think local radio is an amazing platform for faith groups to be heard, because, we don't specialise in bad news on local radio, that is true. So what Aline was saying about the 6 and the 10, we don't necessarily have those challenges. But what I always say to the producers is, if you're making a link with a community like doing Passover, it means that the next time you have to do a story about anti-Semitism, you formed a bond of trust with that community, and you can go to them and get them to speak about the difficult and uncomfortable subjects. So what I always say to the local radio broadcasters is, do those stories. Don't, you have to do some good news stories with faith communities in order to be able to do the bad news stories with them. So, it is an amazing, I always say to people, the BBC belongs to the people, although my daughter and I had a large fight about that. She's 20. She doesn't want to pay her licence fee, and that's like a real problem that we're facing in the BBC, is that young people don't see that they own the BBC, really. So I see that a lot in diverse communities, that people feel that we are a propaganda arm of the government, that they don't want to come onto the BBC. So, I say to people, the BBC belongs to you. It is a public service broadcaster, and you have every right to get in touch with your local radio station and ask to be featured on it, because it belongs to you. Do it. What have you got to lose? You haven't got anything to lose by getting in touch with your local radio station. But I do agree that if you are going to get in touch, it is good to be able to carry through. So if you go with a story and you want to tell it, it's good to then be able to deliver on appearing for that interview, or actually providing the person that you said you would provide. So the passion has to be there, but then the logistics have to also be in place.
Well, you got a vote of confidence from the lady from the Baha'i community for Hereford and Worcester recently as well, so that's good news. Kathryn, you've seen what we've done. You've heard some, the kind of the feedback from the panels here. What do you think we should be doing next? And can we have some money?
Oh, gosh. I think... I'll come back to the question. I'm going to be like a typical politician now and not answer the question directly. I think one of the key things that's come through all of this is about trust and about building relationships. And I think, therefore, something that's going to... You've had great events, and there's been already really good impact. So I think building on that, but looking at whether you perhaps do some more events, but how you build on the ones you've already done as well, and continuing to develop those relationships and those connections between different people. And also I'll come back to schools as well. It was interesting, over lunch we were sort of talking a little bit as well. And I think one of the things I'd like particular journalists and those involved with media to do is to shout about the importance of an education in religion and worldviews, or often referred to as religious education, in schools. Because then, hopefully over time, we will get journalists who are well educated in religion and worldview literacy, who will be wanting to advocate and find those stories and be aware, if you like, of perhaps challenging sometimes sort of relational issues and so on as well. So I'd like to kind of swing it back as well and get journalists and those in the media to really shout for this subject and be advocates for the subject as well. And I know some of you are, and I know some of the people in the audience are as well, already doing that, particularly through social media, but just encourage others to do that. But I think basic comes down to building those relationships, I think, is the key thing from my point of view.
Because I know, Clive, you mentioned media training as perhaps being the next step for communities, but is there actually a place for training journalists who somewhere, we expect a journalist to know about health, education, football, whatever it is, when it comes to faith and religion, is there a gap? You know, what causes that? So Clive, what do you think? Media training for faith communities, but maybe also for journalists too?
I think building those relationships, being relational from and even approaching it from purely relational and trying to understand those communities, that can only help, I think, the quality of output. And I think that trust will be accepted because, look, you know, I think faith communities understand that, you know, the media has a role to do and a job to do. But as I mentioned earlier, I think what was happening in Nottingham, some of the feedback we were getting is that, you know, faith leader will go in front of a journalist and then they'll ask them something that's happened in the news that day about something which is quite controversial, and they would feel out of the loop. It was well explained on the day in Nottingham that for a journalist, that sort of thing to happen is part of journalism. And, you know, that's a really good piece of journalism, a good call. But for faith communities, that would be like a big shock. I mean, I've got friends who are ministers from the black community, and they would be very apprehensive in going into a studio for those kind of causes. But I think communities, journalists coming to understand some of the lifestyle of communities is really important.
Frances, did you?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Clive, to push back there, but I don't remember saying to faith leaders, expect a question about child abuse in your institution, because I think that we would give forewarning of that. That is the respectful thing to do. We did have an incident. I was being spoken to by the Dean of our Catholic Cathedral last week, saying how upset they were that one of their senior cardinals was asked a question about an ongoing investigation in child abuse. And I did sort of half apologise on behalf of the BBC, but the other half said, well, if you are a senior leader in your institution and this is happening, perhaps you should expect. But generally speaking, it is the respectful thing for us to do to give you forewarning. And if you're not happy with something you've been asked, you can always not answer it. But yeah, I think that it's right to name this, though, as an area of caginess.
Alex, you were bursting to say something which is not unusual.
Disagreeing. I mean, I did want to say that with the local radio faith shows, what we did over the pandemic, we started to do these long, these 10-minute reflections from the Muslim, Sikh and Hindu communities, which were run on about 14 of the stations with big communities of those faiths. And we did a half-hour Sunday service. And we've stopped doing that now, but the producers who made the reflections have stayed part of that local radio team. So every week we are hoping to get really good stories from those communities, so that local radio is always going to have those voices on. And that's a commitment, because those guys have got to know people really well over 2 years. You did one, didn't you? One of our reflections? I thought you did. Anyway, whatevs. Yeah. So you know, we're trying with very few resources.
Okay. I'm not going to ignore the rest of the panel. We'll come back to them, but we have got a big panel. But I also want some questions from the audience too. So we can get mics.
So my name is Peter Crumpler. I've been involved in the interface between faith and media for many years. So I'd like to pay tribute to Alex and her work on local radio, particularly through COVID. But can I say, one of the things that COVID taught us, wasn't it, that local is really important. We became much more focused on our local area. Certainly my street now has WhatsApp group, and that's probably the case for most of us sitting in this room today. So in effect, looking around the panel in front of me, right, the esteemed panel, you're all too big. I mean, regional television is massive. Even local radio is really big. The future surely is in hyper-local outlets and how they will serve local communities. And also something I'm seeing, of course, we're all seeing, is people sort of moving away from, getting something in our local newspaper or getting something on our local radio station, moving towards getting something on our community Facebook group. So people are, sadly, for me, moving away from so-called traditional media.
Michelle, you're too big.
No, I was just going to say, but then, of course, if you leave it to communities to write all their own news, you don't have the checks and balances in there, you don't have the professionals who are keeping you on the right side of the law, you don't have the people who are questioning. It would be very easy for that echo chamber to get louder and louder and louder. So it's really important that actually there is that outside involvement as well, however big. I know it is difficult when you cover, a big region.
Jagbir, is this something you recognise amongst faith groups themselves, that actually it's really, really hard when something is as big as regional television or, as the questioner said, even local radio, to kind of penetrate that veneer and to get your voice heard?
Yes, I think, what the Five Cities has done is created those relationships for local communities to build on with the media outlets and everything. And I think one of the things that I'm thinking about, and I'm sorry if I'm flagging up my University of Birmingham, we did a big event in 2019 on campus. It was the first of its kind. It was where the Sikh community brought the Guru Granth Sahib, the Holy Scripture, onto campus and did a 3-day prayer recital. And that's never happened before, nationally, but also internationally. And I remember it was ITV, the local ITV media coming, and they kind of they'd seen a tweet or something on social media that this was happening, and they made contact with us. And then just having those reports going out built up those relationships, and then you had the other media outlets coming in, and I think it became very international. We had India reporters and everything happening, but it's that level of when you build up those relationships, yes, it might seem overwhelming, but once you have those, the community can see that you're interested in the good stories, but also you have that interest in the bad, but you're willing to work with us and engage. And I think for as a Sikh myself, but for the wider Sikh community in Birmingham, that was a really big kind of breaking point.
Okay, thank you. And Mark, just very briefly, because I'm conscious of time, that's what your job's there to do, isn't it? Even if you come from a big region or wherever it is, to make those contacts.
Yeah, I mean, the gentleman identifies a massive challenge, I think, for all news organisations, that kind of fragmentation, that kind of hyper-locality. But I think there is still that place for trusted organisations like BBC, like ITV, big broadcasters who play by the rules, quite frankly. And but part of that is also reflecting and celebrating the stories of communities. And one quick last thing, I think is really important, is that sometimes we just listen. Yeah, okay. That with no agenda about trying to get a story, just actually what's going on with you.
Very good point.
With apologies again, this is the last question.
I'm Mahmouda Qureshi, and I'm the West Midlands Programme Coordinator with the Faith and Belief Forum. I was involved in the event in Birmingham, and we had lots of different faith communities involved in putting the whole programme together. Some of the things that came up from our event was the fact that we felt that there was this level of modesty that's coming from the faith communities, that when they are holding certain events, then they're not, out of modesty, not promoting it as much. So this has a knock-on effect when you've got negative news that's always on the media, then it's something that's affecting the faith communities, that we don't want to brag about the good work that we do. We're doing it for the greater good. So just learning from that, a question there is, what change can we introduce among the faith communities to get positive stories coming from the media.
Who wants to take that very quickly at the end?
So I just think it's about confidence, and having confidence in that your voice will be heard, that it will be respected, and that you are part of a society where the whole media gets to hear your story.
Okay, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like designating someone, isn't it, within your group or, you know, organisation who has that confidence. Because you might get a rude person in the newsroom and you shouldn't be put off by that. You know, you need somebody who can sort of overcome that first step and just keep trying. And, like, I get hundreds of press releases that I might, from an organisation that I might pay no attention to, and then suddenly something will just ping and I'll contact them because it's right for the moment. So, like, it's almost like never give up.
Thank you. I should say I was at the Plymouth and the Manchester event, and it was heartening to see the level of discussions going on and a kind of a recognition, and I speak as somebody who worked for 35 years in journalism, that we need to know our communities, we need to know the faith groups, and if we just dig beneath the surface, there are thousands of stories every single day that we sometimes miss. Thank you to our panel and to our questions from the floor. Thank you.